This property reverts to blood family now. Pack your bags and get out. Wallace Sterling's voice boomed through my living room as I stood in the doorway, still wearing my black funeral dress from yesterday. I watched in stunned silence as he directed his sons to carry out my grandmother's antique chair, the one Julian had loved sitting in while reading his evening newspaper. "You have no right to be here," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the chaos unfolding before me. Wallace turned to face me, his weathered face twisted with satisfaction. "No right. This is family property, girl. Always has been, always will be. Julian is gone now, and you're not blood. Simple as that. I am Eleanor Vance, 37 years old, and until yesterday, I thought I understood my place in this world. For 8 years I had been married to Julian Thorne, a gentle soul who worked as a veterinarian here in Charleston, South Carolina. We had built what I believed was a beautiful life together in the Victorian house his grandfather had left him. But as I watched Wallace's other sons, Byron and Graham, hauling my belongings toward the front door, I realized how naive I had been about his family's true feelings toward me. The morning after laying my husband to rest, I had returned home from my sister's house to find the locks changed, and the Sterling men treating my home like their personal storage unit. Wallace stood in the center of it all, orchestrating the removal of my life, as if I were nothing more than a temporary tenant whose lease had expired. Julian wouldn't want this. I whispered, my hands trembling as I watched them stack my wedding photos carelessly on the porch. "Julian is dead," Wallace snapped. "And he was too soft-hearted when it came to you. We told him from the beginning you were only after the family money, but he wouldn't listen." Well, that charade is over now. The words hit me like physical blows. 8 years of family dinners where I was tolerated but never welcomed. 8 years of conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. 8 years of being treated like an outsider at my own husband's family gatherings. I had endured it all because Julian asked me to, because he believed his family would eventually come around. Byron appeared beside his father, breathing heavily from moving furniture. "Most of her stuff is out, Dad. What about the kitchen things?" "Take what's valuable, leave the rest," Wallace replied without even glancing at me. "She can have until sunset to collect whatever junk we don't want." As I stood there watching them dismantle my life, something cold settled in my chest. They had underestimated me completely, just as they always had. But what they didn't know was that Julian had never underestimated them at all. My relationship with the Sterling family had been strained from the very beginning. When Julian first brought me home to meet his parents 8 years ago, the reception was Arctic at best. I was a nurse from a middle-class family, someone who had worked her way through school and earned everything I had. To Wallace and his wife Gwendolyn, I was clearly beneath their veterinarian son, who came from 3 generations of property owners. "She's very practical," Gwendolyn had said that first evening, her tone making it sound like a disease. I was helping clear the dinner dishes while Julian spoke with his father about expanding the veterinary practice. "I suppose that's important in your line of work." The subtle digs continued through our courtship and into our marriage. They never missed an opportunity to mention the daughters of their friends' girls who had gone to private colleges and came from established families. When Julian and I announced our engagement, Wallace's first question wasn't about our happiness, but about the prenuptial agreement. "You understand, Eleanor, that family property has been passed down through generations," he had said during what he called our pre-wedding discussion. "The house, the land, the practice. These things stay within the bloodline. Julian is young and romantic, but business is business." Julian had grown uncomfortable during that conversation, shifting in his chair beside me. "Dad, we don't need to discuss this now." "Actually, we do," Wallace continued. "Eleanor seems like a sensible girl. I'm sure she understands the importance of preserving family legacy." I had nodded politely, not wanting to cause problems for Julian, but inside I was seething. The way Wallace spoke about me as if I were a gold digger plotting to steal their precious legacy made my stomach turn. What they didn't realize was that I had never wanted their money or their property. I had fallen in love with Julian because of his kindness, his dedication to healing animals, and his gentle spirit. But Julian saw how his family treated me. He noticed the way conversations became stilted when I joined them, how holiday invitations came with subtle suggestions that I might prefer to work that day instead. He watched his mother rearrange seating at family dinners, so I was always placed at the far end of the table. Most importantly, he heard the comments they made when they thought he wasn't listening. "Son, you could do so much better," Gwendolyn had said one Sunday afternoon while I was in the kitchen. I heard every word through the thin walls. "That girl is nice enough, I suppose, but she's not our kind of people." Julian had defended me that day, his voice firm. "Mother Eleanor is exactly my kind of people. She's caring, hardworking, and she makes me happy. That should be enough. Happiness is wonderful, dear, but compatibility matters too. Think about your children, your future. Don't you want someone who can truly be part of this family?" The conversation had ended there, but the damage was done. Julian came into the kitchen afterward and wrapped his arms around me, apologizing for his mother's words. But I could see something shift in his eyes that day. A new understanding of just how unwelcome I would always be in his family circle. The moment that changed everything happened 3 months before Julian died. We had attended his cousin's wedding, another Sterling family gathering where I played my usual role as the polite outsider. During the reception, I excused myself to use the restroom and returned to find the family huddled in deep conversation about estate planning. When Julian goes, the property comes back to the family, right? Graham was asking his father. "I mean, she's not actually entitled to anything long-term, is she?" "Don't be ridiculous," Wallace replied, his voice low but clear. "Wives get temporary rights, but family property always returns to blood. It's been that way for generations. Eleanor will get whatever Julian leaves her in personal effects. But the house, the land, the practice, that all comes back where it belongs." Byron nodded approvingly. "Good. I was worried we might have legal complications with her involved." "The only complication," Gwendolyn added with venom in her voice, "is getting her to leave peacefully when the time comes. You know how these types can be when money is involved." Julian's cousin Preston chimed in. "Maybe she'll remarry quickly and move on. Problem solved." The casual way they discussed my future widowhood, as if Julian's death was an inevitability they were already planning around, made my blood run cold. But what shocked me most was their complete certainty that I had no legitimate claim to the life Julian and I had built together. I slipped back into the bathroom and stayed there until my hands stopped shaking. When I finally returned to the reception, I found Julian chatting with his elderly uncle Francis about new surgical techniques for treating injured wildlife. His face lit up when he saw me, and he immediately pulled me into the conversation. "Uncle Francis was just telling me about the eagle they brought in last week," Julian said, his eyes bright with professional interest. "Eleanor, you remember that case where the patient came in with similar wing damage?" As I listened to them discuss the intricate details of wildlife rehabilitation, I realized how much Julian's family misunderstood him. They saw only the successful veterinarian who would inherit family property. They completely missed the man who stayed up all night nursing injured animals back to health, who donated his services to the local wildlife rescue, who chose love over their narrow definition of social status. That night, as we drove home, I made a decision that would prove crucial in the months to come. "Julian," I said carefully, "I overheard your family talking about estate plans tonight." He glanced at me, his expression immediately growing serious. "What did they say?" "They seem very confident about what happens to our property if something happens to you." Julian was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and took my hand. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something. I've been putting off some important legal matters, but I think it's time we had a serious conversation about our future." That conversation would change everything. The conversation that night revealed a side of Julian First had never fully understood. As we sat in our kitchen, he poured himself a glass of wine and took a deep breath. "I've known for years how my family feels about you," he began, his voice heavy with sadness. "I kept hoping they would change, that they would see what I see in you. But after tonight, I realized they never will." "Julian, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "Eleanor, my family has been planning for your departure since the day we got married. They've convinced themselves that you're temporary, that you'll somehow disappear when it becomes convenient for them." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden we had planted together. "They're operating under some archaic notion that family property automatically reverts to blood relatives when I die. They have no idea how inheritance law actually works, and they've never bothered to ask about my will. My heart began to race. You have a will. Julian turned back to me, and I saw something I had never seen before in his eyes. A steely determination that reminded me he was, after all, a Sterling. I've had a will since the week after we got married, but 3 months ago, after that conversation with my cousin about his upcoming wedding, I decided it wasn't comprehensive enough. He walked to his study and returned with a folder thick with legal documents. I've been working with Robert Maxwell downtown. Do you remember him? He handled the Johnsons' divorce last year. I nodded, remembering the prominent estate attorney who had helped our neighbors through a complicated property dispute. Robert helped me understand something important, Julian continued. My family's assumptions about inheritance are not just wrong, they're legally meaningless. When we got married, I immediately changed all property deeds to joint ownership with right of survivorship. That means everything automatically becomes yours if I die first. The weight of what he was saying began to sink in. But Julian, your family doesn't know this. They have no idea. And that's not all. He opened the folder and spread several documents across our kitchen table. I've drafted a comprehensive will that leaves you everything. The house, the veterinary practice, all bank accounts, investments, everything. More importantly, I've included specific language about why I'm making these decisions. He handed me a letter written in his careful handwriting. As I read it, tears began to fill my eyes. Asterisk. To my family Times, the letter began. Asterisk. If you are reading this, it means I am no longer here to protect Eleanor from your cruelty. For 8 years I have watched you treat my wife as an outsider, someone unworthy of basic respect, let alone love. You have made it clear that you consider her temporary a problem to be solved, rather than a family member to be cherished. Asterisk. The letter continued for 2 full pages, detailing specific instances of their behavior, their assumptions about property rights, and their casual discussions of Eleanor's future. Julian had been paying attention to everything. I had Robert witness it and notarize everything Julian explained. I also had him create backup copies to be held at his office. If anything happens to me, he has instructions to contact you immediately. I looked up from the letter, overwhelmed by the thoroughness of his planning. Julian, this is incredible, but why didn't you tell me sooner? His expression grew sad. Because I hoped I would never need to use it. I kept thinking maybe I could bring them around. Maybe I could make them see how wrong they've been. But after listening to them plan your departure like you're some kind of squatter, I realized they'll never change. So what happens now? Julian reached across the table and took my hands. Now we continue living our lives, loving each other, and building our future together. But if something happens to me, you'll be protected. They won't be able to intimidate you or steal what we've built together. But what about the veterinary practice your family will expect? The practice is mine, Eleanor. I bought out my father's share 3 years ago with my own money. He likes to act like he still owns part of it, but legally it's entirely mine, and now it's entirely ours. 6 weeks later, Julian was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis came after what he thought was just persistent indigestion from too many late-night emergency calls at the clinic. By the time we caught it, the disease had already spread throughout his abdomen. How long? I asked Dr. Hayes, my voice barely a whisper. 6 months, maybe 8 if we're aggressive with treatment, she replied gently. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I wish I had better news. Julian took the news with characteristic calm, immediately shifting into planning mode. That evening, as we processed the devastating diagnosis, he called Robert Maxwell. Robert, it's Julian Thorne. We need to expedite those estate documents we discussed. Yes, it's urgent. Over the next 2 weeks, while Julian began chemotherapy, we spent our evenings updating and finalizing his will. Robert came to our house 3 times, bringing additional paperwork and ensuring every detail was properly documented. Julian, I want to add one more provision, Robert suggested during his final visit. Given what you've told me about your family's behavior, I recommend including a no-contest clause. If anyone challenges this, will they forfeit any potential inheritance entirely? Do it, Julian replied without hesitation. I want Eleanor protected from any legal harassment after I'm gone. As Julian's condition deteriorated, his family's behavior became even more telling. They visited frequently, but their conversations focused almost entirely on business matters and future plans for the property. I noticed them taking inventory of valuable items, discussing which furniture was original Sterling pieces, and making assumptions about what would happen after Julian died. "Eleanor, dear Gwendolyn," said one afternoon while Julian was napping, "have you given any thought to where you'll live afterward? This is my home, Gwendolyn. I plan to stay here." She exchanged a look with Wallace. "Well, of course temporarily, but long-term you'll want to find something more suitable for a single woman. This house is really too large for one person. Plus the upkeep is expensive," Wallace added. "Family property requires family resources to maintain properly." I bit my tongue, remembering Julian's words about not revealing our legal preparations, but their presumption was infuriating. They were already mentally redistributing our life together, treating me like a temporary caretaker whose services would no longer be needed. The worst conversation happened 2 days before Julian died. Byron and Graham came to visit, ostensibly to see their brother, but I overheard them in the hallway making plans. "Dad wants to start moving some of the valuable pieces out before the funeral," Byron whispered. "He's worried Eleanor might try to claim them." "Smart thinking," Graham replied. "We should probably change the locks too, just to avoid any complications." "What about the veterinary practice? Do we need to notify his patients about the transition?" "Dad's already contacted that new vet in Georgetown. Dr. Miller is interested in taking over the client list." I stood frozen outside Julian's room, listening to them plan the dismantling of our life, while my husband lay dying just feet away. They had no idea that every word they spoke was further validating Julian's decision to protect me legally. That night I told Julian what I had overheard. He was weak from the pain medication, but his eyes still flashed with anger. "They're already dividing up our life?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I'm afraid so." Julian closed his eyes for a moment, then looked at me with determination. "Eleanor, promise me something. When they come, and they will come, don't let them intimidate you. You have every legal right to everything we've built together. Robert has all the documents, and he knows exactly what to do." "I promise," I whispered, holding his hand. "And don't feel guilty about fighting them. They've made their choice about how to treat you. Now they'll live with the consequences." Julian died on a Tuesday morning in October, surrounded by the golden light filtering through our bedroom windows. I held his hand as he took his final breath, whispering how much I loved him and how grateful I was for the life we had shared. The funeral was held 2 days later at Trinity Episcopal Church, where we had been married 8 years earlier. The Sterling family took over the arrangements, pushing me aside as they planned what they considered appropriate for their son. I let them handle the details, knowing that soon enough their presumptions would catch up with them. "Eleanor, dear, you'll sit in the second row," Gwendolyn informed me the morning of the service. "Family sits in the front row." I nodded quietly, choosing not to point out that I was his wife, and therefore his closest family. Their behavior was providing me with even more evidence of their complete disregard for my place in Julian's life. After the service, Wallace pulled me aside at the cemetery. "We'll give you a few days to grieve Eleanor, but then we need to discuss practical matters. The house will need to be cleaned out, and we'll need time to prepare it for Byron's family." "Byron's family. He's been wanting to move back to Charleston," Wallace explained, matter-of-factly. "The house is perfect for them, and it keeps the property and the family where it belongs." I stared at him, amazed by his audacity. "Wallace, that house is my home." "Was your home?" he corrected. "You were Julian's wife, and we're grateful for the care you gave him. But now it's time for family property to return to family." "I am family." Wallace's expression hardened. "You're not blood, Eleanor. There's a difference." That night I stayed at my sister Claire Vance's house in Somerville, needing space to process my grief without the additional stress of the Sterling family's expectations. Claire, who had never liked Julian's family, was furious when I told her about their plans. "They can't just kick you out of your own house," she exclaimed. "You were married to Julian for 8 years. They seem very confident about their legal position." I replied calmly. "Well, they're wrong. You need to call a lawyer immediately." I smiled sadly at my sister's outrage. Actually, Claire Julian already took care of that. The next morning I drove back to Charleston, planning to spend the day at the house gathering my thoughts and beginning to sort through Julian's belongings. But as I turned onto our street, I saw Wallace's truck parked in our driveway alongside Byron's van. I sat in my car for a moment watching through the front windows as figures moved around inside my home. They weren't waiting for permission or discussion. They were simply taking what they believed was rightfully theirs. I pulled out my phone and dialed Robert Maxwell's office. "Robert, it's Eleanor Vance. They're at the house now, moving things out. Are you there?" "I'm sitting in my car outside. They don't know I'm here yet." "Perfect. Don't go inside alone. I'll be there in 20 minutes with copies of all the documents. Do you remember what Julian told you to do?" "Let them dig their hole deeper," I replied, recalling Julian's exact words. "Exactly. The more presumptuous they are, the clearer it becomes that Julian was right to protect you legally." As I waited for Robert to arrive, I watched Wallace direct his sons like he was overseeing a construction project. They were loading my grandmother's rocking chair into Byron's van, the chair I had inherited from my mother's side of the family. That's when I knew the time for politeness was over. I got out of my car and walked toward the house, ready to face whatever came next. I stood in the doorway of my own home, watching Wallace orchestrate the removal of my life with military precision. Byron was wrapping my grandmother's china in newspaper, while Graham loaded Julian's favorite reading chair onto their truck. "You're back sooner than expected," Wallace said, when he noticed me not even having the grace to look embarrassed about being caught looting my house. "We thought you might want to stay away for a few more days while we handle the transition." "The transition?" I asked quietly. "Getting the house ready for Byron's family. Don't worry, we'll pack your personal items separately. You can pick them up once you've found somewhere else to live." I watched him for a moment, marveling at his absolute certainty. "Wallace, I need to tell you something important." "What's that, dear?" "You forgot one crucial thing." His expression shifted slightly. "What do you mean?" Before I could answer, Robert Maxwell's silver BMW pulled into the driveway. Wallace's face went pale as he recognized the prominent estate attorney stepping out of the car with a briefcase full of legal documents. "Mr. Sterling," Robert called out as he approached the front door. "I'm Robert Maxwell, Julian's attorney. I believe we need to have a conversation." "I don't understand," Wallace stammered. "What's this about?" Robert looked around at the furniture being loaded into trucks, then back at Wallace with professional calm. "It's about the fact that you're currently removing property that belongs to Eleanor Vance, and you need to stop immediately." Byron dropped the box he was carrying. "What are you talking about? This is family property." "Actually," Robert replied, opening his briefcase. "Legally speaking, everything you've touched today belongs to Eleanor. Julian left a comprehensive will, and I have the documentation right here." Graham stopped loading the truck. "A will? But family property always. Family property follows legal ownership, not assumptions." Robert interrupted, and Julian made his wishes very clear. Robert spread the legal documents across our kitchen table, while the Sterling men gathered around, their confident expressions rapidly changing to confusion and then anger. "This will dated 6 months ago, and properly witnessed leaves everything to Eleanor Vance," Robert explained methodically. "The house, the veterinary practice, all bank accounts, investments, and personal property, everything." Wallace's face turned red. "That's impossible. Family property has been passed down for generations. You can't just give it away to outsiders. Mr. Sterling, your son, owned this property outright. He could leave it to whomever he chose, and he chose his wife." "But she's not blood family," Gwendolyn protested. Robert pulled out another document. "Actually, under South Carolina law, spouses have automatic inheritance rights that supersede any family traditions. But more importantly, Julian also changed all property deeds to joint ownership with right of survivorship." Wallace Sterling's declaration ripped through the air like a thunderclap, each word laced with the bitter sting of entitlement and dismissal. It was a pronouncement meant to obliterate any sense of belonging I might have clung to, a stark reminder that in their eyes I was nothing more than an outsider, a temporary fixture in their carefully curated world. My black funeral dress, still bearing the faint scent of lilies and loss, felt like a heavy shroud mirroring the suffocating weight of their judgment. I stood frozen, a silent witness to the violation of my home, as Wallace's sons Byron and Graham, under their father's gruff direction, began to systematically dismantle my life. It was like watching a carefully constructed sandcastle being swept away by an uncaring tide. The object of their immediate attention was my grandmother's antique chair, a cherished piece of my family history. The very chair Julian had so loved to settle into each evening with his newspaper, the warm glow of the reading lamp illuminating his kind face. The sight of them manhandling it, treating it with such disregard, sent a fresh wave of grief crashing over me. It wasn't just a chair. It was a symbol of comfort, of shared evenings and quiet companionship. It was a piece of my Time's family being carted away by Time's his asterisk. Summoning every ounce of composure I could muster, I finally spoke my voice, a quiet counterpoint to the boisterous intrusion. "You have no right to be here." My words hung in the air, seemingly unnoticed by the Sterling sons as they continued their grim task. But Wallace, ever the patriarch, turned to face me, his face, a roadmap of wrinkles etched by years of self-assuredness and a distinct lack of empathy. A chilling smile played on his lips, a clear indication that he relished the power he wielded. "No right. This is family property, girl. Always has been, always will be. Julian's gone now, and you're not blood." Simple as that. Each word was a deliberate cut, a calculated attempt to diminish my worth, to reduce me to nothing more than a nameless, bloodless entity. I am Eleanor Vance, 37 years old. Until yesterday, I believed I had a firm grasp on my place in the tapestry of life. For 8 years, I had been happily married to Julian Thorne, a man whose gentle spirit and unwavering compassion touched the lives of everyone he met, especially the countless animals he cared for as a veterinarian in this charming southern city of Charleston, South Carolina. Together, we had nurtured a life filled with love and contentment within the walls of the Victorian house he had inherited from his grandfather, a house that had become our sanctuary, our haven from the storms of the outside world. But now, watching Byron and Graham so callously stripping away the artifacts of our shared existence, I felt a painful awakening. I had been living under a carefully constructed illusion, blind to the deep-seated prejudice and resentment that simmered beneath the surface of the Sterling family's polite facade. I had foolishly believed that time and love could bridge the chasm between us, but their actions now revealed the unshakable truth to them. I would always be an outsider, an unwelcome intruder in their privileged domain. The morning after Julian's burial, after a sleepless night spent at my sister's house racked with grief and exhaustion, I had dared to return to my Time's home, seeking solace amidst the familiar surroundings. But what awaited me was a scene of utter desecration. The locks had been changed, barring me from entry, and the Sterling men were treating my home as nothing more than a storage unit, a place to discard my belongings and reclaim their family legacy. And there, in the midst of the chaos, stood Wallace the puppet master, orchestrating the entire heartless production, dismissing my life as though it were a temporary tenancy that had simply run its course. A wave of nausea washed over me as I watched them with mounting horror. Julian wouldn't want this. I managed to whisper, my voice trembling with a mixture of grief and disbelief, as they casually stacked our wedding photos on the porch, the images of our joy and commitment now rendered meaningless. Wallace, without a trace of remorse, shot back, "Julian is dead. And he was too soft-hearted when it came to you. We told him from the beginning you were only after the family money, but he wouldn't listen. Well, that charade is over now." His words hit me with the force of a physical blow, each syllable a sharp shard of ice piercing through my heart. 8 years. 8 years of enduring strained family dinners, where my presence was merely tolerated, never truly embraced. 8 years of conversations abruptly ceasing as I entered the room, my presence a disruption to their exclusive circle. 8 years of being treated like an outsider, a gatecrasher at my own husband's family gatherings. I had persevered, swallowing my pride and enduring their subtle barbs, all because Julian had pleaded with me to do so, convinced that in time his family would eventually come to accept me. Byron, his face flushed with exertion from hauling heavy furniture, lumbered up beside his father. "Most of her stuff is out, Dad. What about the kitchen things?" Wallace, without even deigning to glance in my direction, delivered his callous verdict. "Take what's valuable, leave the rest." She can have until sunset to collect whatever junk we don't want. As I stood there witnessing the systematic dismantling of my life, a chilling sensation settled in my chest, a cold knot of defiance hardening my resolve. They had underestimated me consistently and completely. They mistook my kindness for weakness, my patience for acceptance. But what they failed to grasp, what they could never comprehend, was that Julian had seen through their charade from the very beginning. He had understood their true nature, their unwavering dedication to preserving their family's wealth and status at any cost. And because of that understanding, he had taken steps to protect me, to ensure that their callous machinations would not succeed. My relationship with the Sterling family had been fraught with tension from the very outset. The first encounter 8 years ago, when Julian proudly brought me home to meet his parents, was met with an icy reception. I was in their eyes simply not good enough. A nurse from a middle-class family, someone who had clawed her way through school working tirelessly to achieve everything I had. To Wallace and Gwendolyn, I was a clear social downgrade. A mere commoner, unworthy of their son, a veterinarian of esteemed lineage and heir to 3 generations of property ownership. "She's very practical," Gwendolyn had remarked that first evening, her tone laced with thinly veiled disdain, as if practicality were a contagious disease. I had been helping to clear the dinner dishes, quietly efficient, while Julian engaged in a conversation with his father about expanding the veterinary practice. "I suppose that's important in your line of work," she added, her words dripping with condescension. The subtle digs, the veiled insults continued relentlessly throughout our courtship and into our marriage. They never missed an opportunity to subtly promote the virtues of the daughters of their friends' girls who had attended prestigious private colleges and hailed from established Charleston families, girls who in their eyes were far more suitable matches for Julian. Even when Julian and I announced our engagement, Wallace's initial reaction wasn't one of joy or congratulations, but rather a cold, calculating inquiry about the prenuptial agreement. "You understand, Eleanor, that family property has been passed down through generations," he had stated during what he coldly referred to as our pre-wedding discussion. "The house, the land, the practice. These things stay within the bloodline. Julian is young and romantic, but business is business." Julian visibly squirmed in his chair beside me, clearly uncomfortable with his father's blunt pronouncements. "Dad, we don't need to discuss this now." "Actually, we do." Wallace had countered, his voice unwavering. "Eleanor seems like a sensible girl. I'm sure she understands the importance of preserving family legacy." I had forced a polite nod, determined not to cause any unnecessary friction for Julian, but inside I was seething with indignation. The way Wallace spoke of me, as if I were a scheming gold digger plotting to pilfer their precious legacy, made my stomach churn. What they stubbornly refused to acknowledge was that I had never harbored any desire for their money or their property. I had fallen deeply in love with Julian because of his inherent kindness, his unwavering dedication to healing animals, and his gentle, compassionate soul. The material trappings of his life were utterly irrelevant to me. But Julian wasn't oblivious to his family's treatment of me. He noticed the strained silences that descended upon the room whenever I joined their gatherings, the carefully orchestrated shift in conversation to topics from which I was excluded. He observed the subtle cues in holiday invitations, the thinly veiled suggestions that I might prefer to work that day, instead freeing me from the burden of their company. He witnessed his mother's meticulous rearranging of seating arrangements at family dinners, ensuring that I was always relegated to the far end of the table, a symbolic representation of my outsider status. Most importantly, he heard the cutting remarks they made when they mistakenly believed he was out of earshot. "Son, you could do so much better," Gwendolyn had lamented one Sunday afternoon, her voice carrying through the thin kitchen walls while I was busy preparing lunch. "That girl is nice enough, I suppose, but she's simply not our time's kind of people." Julian, to his credit, had defended me that day, his voice uncharacteristically firm and unwavering. "Mother Eleanor is exactly my kind of people. She's caring, hard-working, and she makes me incredibly happy. That should be more than enough. Happiness is wonderful, dear, but compatibility matters too. Think about your children, your future. Don't you want someone who can truly be part of this family?" The conversation had abruptly ended there, leaving a palpable tension hanging in the air. Julian, his face etched with a mixture of guilt and frustration, had come into the kitchen afterward, wrapping his arms around me in a silent apology for his mother's hurtful words. But I could see a subtle shift in his eyes that day, a dawning realization of the true extent of his family's prejudice, a new understanding of just how permanently unwelcome I would always be in their tightly knit circle. The defining moment, the catalyst that set the stage for everything that followed, occurred 3 months before Julian's untimely death. We had attended his cousin's wedding, yet another obligatory Sterling family gathering where I was relegated to my usual role as the polite peripheral observer. During the wedding reception, I excused myself to use the restroom. Upon returning, I discovered the family huddled together in a hushed, intense discussion about estate planning. When Julian goes, the property all comes back to the family. Right? Graham was pointedly asking his father, his voice laced with a barely concealed eagerness. I mean, she's not actually entitled to anything long-term, is she? Don't be ridiculous. Wallace had dismissively replied, his voice low but cuttingly clear. Wives are only granted temporary rights. Family property always returns to the bloodline. It's been that way for generations. Eleanor will get whatever Julian leaves her in personal effects, but the house, the land, the practice, that all comes back where it rightfully belongs. Byron had nodded in smug agreement. Good. I was worried we might face legal complications with her involvement. The Times-only Times complication, Gwendolyn had interjected, her voice, dripping with undisguised venom, is going to be getting her to leave peacefully when the time comes. You know how those times can be when money is involved. Julian's cousin Preston had casually chimed in with his own callous suggestion. Maybe she'll remarry quickly and move on. Problem solved. The sheer nonchalance with which they discussed my future widowhood, as if Julian's death was a mere inevitability they were already strategizing around, sent a jolt of icy dread through my veins. But what truly shocked me to the core was their unwavering certainty that I had absolutely no legitimate claim to the life that Julian and I had painstakingly built together. I quietly retreated back into the bathroom, seeking refuge from their cruel machinations. I remained there until the trembling in my hands finally subsided. When I eventually emerged and made my way back to the reception, I found Julian deeply engrossed in a conversation with his elderly Uncle Francis. They were discussing the intricacies of new surgical techniques for treating injured wildlife. Julian's face was illuminated with genuine passion as he spoke about his work, his eyes sparkling with professional interest. The sight of his enthusiasm momentarily distracted me from the chilling conversation I had just overheard. When he caught sight of me, his face lit up with a warm smile, and he eagerly pulled me into their discussion. Uncle Francis was just telling me about the eagle they brought in last week, Julian exclaimed, his voice brimming with excitement. Eleanor, you remember that case where the patient came in with similar wing damage? As I listened to them delve into the intricate details of wildlife rehabilitation, sharing their knowledge and passion with each other, I was struck by the profound disconnect between the man I loved and the warped perception of him held by his family. They saw only the successful veterinarian, the heir to the Sterling family legacy, the custodian of their precious property. They completely failed to recognize the true essence of Julian, the man who dedicated countless with right of survivorship. Even without the will, everything would have gone to Eleanor automatically. Byron looked completely stunned. You mean we have absolutely no claim to any of this? None whatsoever. As a matter of fact, by removing property without permission, you're technically committing theft, plain and simple. The room went dead silent except for Gwendolyn's sharp, ragged breathing. Wallace just slumped down into a chair, the full weight of his massive miscalculation finally crashing down on him. There's more, Robert continued, pulling out Julian's letter. Julian also left behind some incredibly detailed instructions about why he made all of these decisions, and then he started reading it aloud. To my family, if you are reading this right now, it means I am no longer around to protect Eleanor from your particular brand of cruelty. For a solid 8 years, I have personally watched you all treat my wife like some kind of outsider, someone who just doesn't belong. As Robert kept reading Julian's words, meticulously documenting years and years of subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, mistreatment, The Sterling family's faces just grew paler and paler, practically turning to ash. Julian had clearly been paying very close attention to absolutely everything, every single slight, every dismissive comment, every single assumption that Eleanor was somehow temporary in his life. Furthermore, Robert went on, Julian included what's called a no contest clause, meaning any attempt whatsoever to challenge this will is going to automatically result in the immediate forfeiture of any potential inheritance. Wallace finally understood the full sweeping scope of his son's incredibly protective final act. Within just a few short hours of Robert's shocking revelation, the Sterling family was facing the utter complete collapse of absolutely everything they had just assumed to be true. Wallace was immediately forced to return each and every single item they had removed from the house, including my grandmother's antique chair, which had somehow mysteriously ended up crammed into the back of Byron's van. The locks they had so sneakily changed were immediately replaced at their considerable expense, and they were permanently banned from even setting foot on the property ever again without my express written permission. The veterinary practice that Wallace had already presumptuously promised to Dr. Miller remained completely mine to operate or even sell if I chose to, exactly as I pleased. The family land that they had all considered to be their absolute birthright was now permanently and irrevocably outside of their control. Their casual little planning sessions about my supposed departure became damning evidence of their utter and complete misunderstanding of both cold, hard legal reality and Julian's very real, very strong feelings about each and every one of them. Gwendolyn's desperate hopes of somehow maintaining her oh-so-precious social standing were utterly shattered into a million pieces when word rapidly spread throughout their entire social circle about their incredibly brazen attempt to steal from their own deceased son's grieving widow. Byron's meticulously laid plans to move his entire family into the prestigious family house completely evaporated into thin air, leaving him scrambling to desperately explain to his wife and kids why their promised new dream home was suddenly and permanently no longer available to them. Graham's arrogant assumptions about automatically inheriting part of the thriving veterinary practice instantly cost him the cushy job he had always just assumed was absolutely guaranteed to him. But most devastatingly for Wallace, the immense respect that he had always commanded as the unquestioned Sterling family patriarch completely disappeared overnight, when everyone learned just how thoroughly his own son had completely rejected his core values and had gone to absolutely incredible lengths to protect his beloved wife from the family's constant cruelty. The very same man who had actually spent decades lecturing absolutely everyone else about the paramount importance of family loyalty suddenly discovered that his own son's final defiant act was one of complete and utter rejection of absolutely everything that Wallace actually represented in this world. As I just stood there quietly in my kitchen that evening, tightly holding Julian's poignant letter in my trembling hands, and surrounded by all of the personal belongings that his greedy family had so brazenly tried to steal from me, I finally realized that my late husband's greatest, most precious gift to me wasn't the beautiful house or the considerable amount of money. It was the profound and enduring validation that our deep love had been incredibly real, that I had been completely worthy of his unwavering protection, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the quietest, most unassuming people fight the absolute hardest battles for the precious people they truly love. The complete and utter revenge was finally complete, not because I had meticulously planned it that way, but simply because Julian had seen his family's true ugly nature years and years before I ever did, and had quietly, methodically built towering walls around our sacred love that they could simply never ever breach, no matter how hard they tried.